My name is Marlene, and I'm 28 years old. 3 years ago, I thought I had found my perfect family when I married Dennis. I was 9 months pregnant, living in what I believed was my dream home with my husband and his mother. I trusted them completely. I never imagined that during the most vulnerable moment of my life, the people I loved most would betray me in the cruelest way possible. They left me screaming in labor on my own front porch, watching through the window as I begged for help. But what they didn't know was that their betrayal would awaken a strength in me they never saw coming. Before we dive into this unbelievable story, I'd love to know where you're watching from. Please hit that like button and subscribe to hear more stories like this one. Trust me, you won't believe what happened next when I decided to take back control of my life. Meeting Dennis felt like a fairy tale come true. 4 years ago, I was sitting in my favorite coffee shop in downtown Austin, grading papers from my kindergarten class, when this charming man approached my table. He was tall, well-dressed, with kind eyes, and a warm smile that made my heart skip a beat. Dennis worked as a financial advisor at Preston & Associates, one of the most prestigious firms in the city. He made excellent money and seemed to have his life perfectly together. Our whirlwind romance was like something out of a movie. Dennis would surprise me with flowers at school, take me to expensive restaurants, and plan weekend getaways to San Antonio and Dallas. He was attentive romantic and made me feel like the most important person in his world. After 18 months of dating, he proposed at the same coffee shop where we first met, getting down on one knee in front of everyone. I said yes, without hesitation. We bought our beautiful 2-story colonial house in Westlake Hills just before our wedding. It had 4 bedrooms, a spacious kitchen with granite countertops, and a backyard perfect for the children we planned to have. The neighborhood was quiet and family-friendly with tree-lined streets and friendly neighbors. I felt like I was living in a dream. 6 months after our wedding, Dennis's father suffered a massive heart attack and passed away suddenly. Dennis was devastated, and his mother Geraldine was left alone in the family home they had shared for 35 years. She was 58 years old and claimed she couldn't bear to stay in the house filled with memories of her late husband. Dennis suggested she move in with us temporarily while she figured out her next steps. I welcomed Geraldine with open arms, wanting to support Dennis during his grief and genuinely believing this arrangement would be temporary. She seemed fragile and lost, and I thought having family close would help us all heal together. Geraldine was a retired bank manager who had always been the organizing force in her family. She was impeccably dressed, well-spoken, and initially seemed grateful for our hospitality. However, things began to change subtly within the first few weeks. Geraldine started rearranging our furniture, claiming she was just trying to make the space more functional. She would reorganize my kitchen cabinets while I was at work, moving everything to different locations that made sense to her, but confused me. When I gently mentioned that I preferred my original organization system, she would smile sweetly and say she was just trying to help make things more efficient. The criticism started small and seemed almost caring at first. Geraldine would comment that my chicken was a little dry, or suggest that I might want to try a different laundry detergent because the one I used didn't seem to get Dennis's work shirts quite clean enough. She would offer to do the grocery shopping, then return with completely different brands than what I had requested, explaining that these were better quality or better value. When I tried to discuss these issues with Dennis, he would dismiss my concerns immediately. He would say his mother was just trying to help, and that she was still grieving and adjusting to living with us. He reminded me that she had run her own household for decades and naturally had strong opinions about domestic matters. Dennis seemed genuinely oblivious to how his mother's constant corrections and changes were making me feel unwelcome in my own home. 8 months into our marriage, I discovered I was pregnant. The moment I saw those 2 pink lines on the pregnancy test, I was overwhelmed with joy and excitement. I had always dreamed of being a mother, and Dennis and I had talked extensively about starting our family. I planned a special dinner to tell him the news, complete with a tiny pair of baby booties as a surprise. Dennis's reaction was everything I had hoped for. He picked me up and spun me around the kitchen, laughing and crying at the same time. We spent the evening talking about baby names, planning the nursery, and imagining our future as parents. It felt like the most perfect moment of our marriage, and I felt so grateful for the family we were building together. Geraldine's reaction to our pregnancy announcement was notably different. When we shared the news over dinner the next evening, she paused with her fork halfway to her mouth and stared at us for a long moment. Then she set down her utensils and said, "Well, I suppose congratulations are in order, though. I do think you're both rather young and inexperienced for such a big responsibility." She went on to suggest that Dennis should have focused on advancing his career further before taking on the financial burden of a child. Throughout my pregnancy, Geraldine became increasingly controlling and invasive. She insisted on accompanying me to every doctor's appointment, claiming she wanted to make sure I was getting proper medical care. During these visits, she would ask the doctor questions about my care and make suggestions about my diet and exercise routine as if I weren't capable of managing my own pregnancy. The nursery became a particular battleground. Geraldine had very strong opinions about everything from the color scheme to the placement of furniture. She would make disapproving comments about the items I chose, suggesting alternatives that she deemed more practical or appropriate. When I selected a beautiful crib with white spindles and soft pink bedding, she frowned and said it looked too delicate and wouldn't hold up well over time. As my due date approached in early March, the tension in our household became almost unbearable. Geraldine had become increasingly bold in her attempts to control every aspect of my pregnancy and our preparations for the baby. She would call my doctor's office to ask about my appointments and try to get information about my medical care without my permission. The office staff had to put a note in my file that only I could access my medical information. The baby name discussions became particularly contentious. Dennis and I had agreed on Emma Rose for a girl and James Michael for a boy. We loved these names and felt they honored both sides of our family while being beautiful and timeless. However, Geraldine strongly disapproved of our choices. She felt Emma was too modern and suggested more traditional names like Margaret or Elizabeth. She would bring up her objections repeatedly, often in front of other people, which embarrassed me and made me feel like my opinions didn't matter. 2 weeks before my due date, I experienced what would become the most hurtful incident up to that point. I had taken my final day of work before maternity leave, saying goodbye to my kindergarten students and finishing up my lesson plans for the substitute teacher who would take over my class. I was exhausted, but happy, looking forward to having time to rest and prepare for the baby's arrival. When I arrived home that afternoon, I discovered that Geraldine had completely rearranged the nursery without consulting me. The crib had been moved from the wall where I had carefully positioned it to catch the morning light to a corner where it felt cramped and dark. The mobile I had hung above the changing table was gone, replaced with one she had purchased that featured cartoon animals instead of the elegant butterflies I had selected. Most shocking of all, she had removed several of the decorative items I had chosen and replaced them with things that reflected her taste rather than mine. I stood in the doorway of what was supposed to be my baby's room, feeling completely violated and heartbroken. This was the space where I would nurse my daughter, where I would rock her to sleep, where we would share countless precious moments together. Every item in that room had been carefully chosen with love and anticipation. To have someone else rearrange it without my permission felt like a complete dismissal of my role as this baby's mother. When I confronted Geraldine about the changes, she responded with what I was beginning to recognize as her typical pattern of manipulation. She claimed she was only trying to help and that the new arrangement was much more practical and functional. She pointed out that the crib was now positioned away from the window, which she claimed was safer, and that she had chosen items that were more durable and would last longer as the baby grew. Dennis arrived home from work to find me in tears in the nursery. Instead of comforting me or acknowledging that his mother had overstepped serious boundaries, he examined the room and commented that the new arrangement did seem more practical. He suggested that I was being emotional due to my pregnancy hormones, and that I should appreciate his mother's experience and expertise in child rearing. The financial control issues began around the same time. Dennis started making unilateral decisions about our money, claiming that as the primary breadwinner, he needed to take charge of our finances now that I was going on maternity leave. He opened a separate savings account specifically for baby expenses, but didn't give me access to it, or even tell me which bank it was at. When I asked about this arrangement, he said he was protecting our family's financial security and that I didn't need to worry about such matters. I felt increasingly isolated and trapped in my own home. My mother lived in Portland, Oregon, nearly 2,000 miles away, and couldn't travel due to her own health issues. Many of my friendships had become strained during my marriage, as Dennis and Geraldine demanded more and more of my time and attention. My colleagues at school were supportive, but busy with their own lives and families. The breaking point came during a dinner conversation about my birth plan just 5 days before my due date. I had spent considerable time researching different birthing options and had discussed my preferences extensively with Dr. Patricia Williams, my obstetrician. I wanted to try for a natural birth with minimal medical intervention, using breathing techniques and movement to manage pain naturally. Dr. Williams had assured me that I was a good candidate for this approach and that she would support my choices. When I mentioned this plan during dinner, Geraldine immediately became agitated and confrontational. She insisted that natural birth was unnecessarily dangerous and that I should schedule a cesarean section instead. She claimed that surgical delivery was more controlled and safer for both mother and baby. She went on to describe in graphic detail all the things that could go wrong during natural labor, seeming to take pleasure in frightening me about the birthing process. I tried to explain that I had researched my options thoroughly and had discussed them with my doctor, who had assured me that a natural birth was safe for me and the baby. I explained that this was an important personal choice and that I felt confident in my decision. However, Geraldine wouldn't listen to my reasoning and continued to insist that I was being selfish and irresponsible. What hurt most was Dennis's response to this confrontation. Instead of supporting his wife and my right to make decisions about my own body and birthing experience, he suggested that we should consider all options and maybe his mother had valid points about the benefits of surgical delivery. He said we should discuss it further with the doctor and keep an open mind about changing the birth plan. The night that would forever change my life began on a Tuesday evening, March 15th, just 3 days before my official due date. I had been experiencing mild, irregular contractions throughout the day, but I assumed they were Braxton Hicks contractions, which Dr. Williams had told me to expect in the final weeks of pregnancy. I went about my normal routine doing some light housework and preparing a casserole for dinner. By early evening, I noticed that the contractions were becoming more regular and noticeably stronger. I began timing them carefully using the app on my phone that I had downloaded specifically for this purpose. At first, they were coming every 7 to 8 minutes and lasting about 30 seconds each. I didn't want to alarm anyone prematurely, so I continued with my evening activities while monitoring the pattern. Around 8 o'clock, the contractions intensified dramatically and became much more regular. They were now coming every 5 minutes and lasting over a minute each. I recognized this pattern from our childbirth classes as early active labor. My heart began racing with excitement and nervousness as I realized that Emma was finally ready to make her entrance into the world. I called for Dennis, who was in the living room watching a basketball game with Geraldine. They both looked up when I entered the room, and I could see the concern in Dennis's eyes as he noticed my obvious discomfort. I explained that I was pretty sure I was in labor and that we should start getting ready to head to the hospital. I had packed my hospital bag 3 weeks earlier, and it was sitting ready by the front door. Dennis looked immediately to his mother, which should have been my first warning sign. Instead of jumping up to help me or expressing excitement about the baby's imminent arrival, he seemed to be waiting for Geraldine's guidance about how to respond. Geraldine set down her magazine and looked at me with what I can only describe as cold calculation. She told us we should wait longer before going to the hospital because first-time mothers often experienced false labor that could last for hours or even days. She claimed that hospitals would just send us home if I wasn't far enough along in labor, and that it was better to labor at home as long as possible. This advice contradicted everything we had learned in our birthing classes and everything Dr. Williams had told us about when to head to the hospital. As the contractions continued to intensify, I became more insistent about leaving for the hospital. Each contraction was now requiring my full attention, and I had to stop talking and focus on breathing through the pain. I reminded Dennis that Dr. Williams had specifically told us to come to the hospital when contractions were 5 minutes apart for an hour, and we had already passed that milestone. However, Geraldine continued to dismiss my concerns and insisted that we wait longer. She claimed that she had given birth to 3 children and knew what real labor looked like. She said I was probably just experiencing strong Braxton Hicks contractions and that real labor would be much more intense than what I was experiencing. Her confidence in her assessment made Dennis hesitate, and I could see him wavering between supporting me and deferring to his mother's supposed expertise. At 10:30, my water broke suddenly and dramatically while I was standing in the kitchen. The warm fluid gushed down my legs, soaking through my nightgown and creating a puddle on the floor. There was no mistaking this sign that labor was progressing rapidly and that we needed to get to the hospital immediately. The breaking of my water also intensified the contractions significantly, and I had to grip the kitchen counter to steady myself through the next wave of pain. I called urgently for Dennis, expecting him to spring into action now that there was clear evidence that I was in active labor. Instead, I heard hushed, urgent conversation between him and Geraldine in the living room. I couldn't make out their exact words, but their tone suggested they were having some kind of disagreement or serious discussion about the situation. When Dennis finally came to check on me, his entire demeanor had changed. Gone was any trace of excitement or concern for my well-being. His face was cold and distant, and he avoided making direct eye contact with me. Geraldine stood directly behind him, and I noticed she had a satisfied, almost triumphant expression that made my blood run cold. Dennis told me in a voice I had never heard him use before that he and his mother had been discussing the situation, and they had decided it would be best if I went to the hospital alone. The words seemed to hang in the air between us, and for a moment I was certain I had misunderstood him. I asked him to repeat what he had said because I couldn't believe my own ears. Geraldine stepped forward and began explaining their reasoning with chilling calmness and authority. She said that Dennis was too emotionally invested in the birth and would likely become a distraction in the delivery room. She claimed that as an experienced mother who had been through labor multiple times, she knew that I needed to focus entirely on the birthing process without worrying about Dennis's emotional needs or reactions. They suggested that I could call them once the baby was born, and they would come to the hospital to meet their daughter. Geraldine emphasized that this arrangement would be better for everyone involved, especially for the baby who needed her mother to be completely focused during the delivery process. What happened next remains the most traumatic and unbelievable experience of my entire life. As my contractions intensified to every 3 minutes, I realized that Dennis and Geraldine were completely serious about their decision to abandon me during childbirth. The pain was becoming overwhelming, and I knew from our birthing classes that I needed to get to the hospital quickly. I grabbed my hospital bag and reached for my car keys, determined to drive myself to the hospital if necessary. However, When I picked up my keys from the kitchen counter, Dennis quickly intercepted them, snatching them out of my hand. He claimed that I was in no condition to drive safely, and that I might cause an accident that could hurt myself, the baby, or other drivers. The panic began to set in as I realized I was essentially trapped in my own home. I begged Dennis to at least call an ambulance if he and his mother refused to take me to the hospital themselves. This seemed like a reasonable compromise that would ensure I got the medical care I desperately needed while respecting their bizarre decision not to be present for the birth. However, Geraldine immediately shut down this suggestion, claiming that ambulance rides were expensive and completely unnecessary for what she called normal labor. She insisted that women had been giving birth for thousands of years without medical intervention, and that I was being overly dramatic about a natural process. Her dismissive attitude toward my pain and fear was shocking and cruel. In desperation, I tried to call 911 myself using my cell phone. As I dialed the number with shaking fingers, Dennis grabbed the phone out of my hands before I could complete the call. He claimed I was being hysterical and not thinking clearly about what was best for our family. He said I needed to calm down and trust their judgment about the situation. The contractions were now coming every 2 minutes, and I could feel the baby descending in my pelvis. I knew from our birthing classes that this meant I was in transition, the most intense phase of labor that immediately precedes the urge to push. I was terrified that I might end up giving birth in our living room without any medical assistance. In a moment of desperation and determination, I decided to leave the house and seek help from our neighbors. Surely, someone in our friendly neighborhood would be willing to drive a woman in labor to the hospital, or at least call for medical assistance. I headed toward the front door, moving as quickly as I could between contractions. Dennis immediately moved to block my path, positioning himself between me and the door. When I tried to push past him, explaining that I needed help and couldn't wait any longer, both he and Geraldine physically restrained me. They grabbed my arms and forcibly prevented me from reaching the door, with Geraldine saying coldly that I needed to calm down and think rationally about what was best for the baby. I struggled against their grip, becoming increasingly frantic as another powerful contraction hit. The pain was overwhelming, and I knew the baby was coming soon, whether we were at the hospital or not. I pleaded with Dennis to remember his wedding vows, to remember that he had promised to love and protect me, and to think about what he was doing to his wife and unborn child. But the most shocking and heartbreaking betrayal was yet to come. When I finally managed to break free from their grip and reach the front door, I heard the most terrifying sound imaginable. The deadbolt clicked shut behind me as Dennis and Geraldine actually locked me out of my own home while I was in active labor. I found myself standing on my own front porch in a thin nightgown and robe, contractions coming every 90 seconds, completely abandoned by the people who were supposed to love and protect me most. It was a cold March evening, and I was shivering both from the temperature and from shock at what was happening to me. I pounded on the door with my fists, screaming for them to let me back inside. I begged Dennis to remember who he was, to remember that he loved me, to think about our daughter who was about to be born. I could see both of them through the living room window, sitting calmly, as if nothing unusual was happening. Dennis had returned to watching television, while Geraldine sat reading her magazine, both of them completely ignoring my desperate pleas for help. The contractions were becoming unbearable, and I dropped to my hands and knees on the porch steps, crying and screaming in pain. I had never felt so alone and terrified in my entire life. This was supposed to be one of the most beautiful and meaningful moments of my life, and instead, I was experiencing it as a nightmare of abandonment and betrayal. Fortunately, our neighbors began to notice the commotion. Mrs. Joyce Thompson from the house next door came running over in her bathrobe and slippers, having been awakened by my screams. She found me on the porch steps, doubled over in pain and sobbing hysterically. Joyce immediately grasped the severity of the situation and called 911 while trying to comfort me and keep me warm. Other neighbors began gathering, offering blankets, pillows, and words of comfort. Mrs. Rodriguez from across the street brought towels in case the baby arrived before the ambulance. Mr. and Mrs. Chen from 2 houses down stood guard, making sure I felt safe and protected. Through it all, Dennis and Geraldine remained inside the house, watching through the curtains, but refusing to open the door or offer any assistance to their laboring daughter-in-law and wife. The ambulance arrived 25 minutes after Joyce called, though it felt like hours to me. The paramedics were shocked and horrified to find a woman in advanced labor who had been locked out of her own home by her husband. They quickly assessed my condition and determined that I was already 8 centimeters dilated and needed to be transported to the hospital immediately. As they wheeled me toward the ambulance on a stretcher, I looked back at my house one final time. Dennis and Geraldine were still at the window watching the scene unfold with no visible emotion or concern. In that moment, I realized that my marriage was over and that I would need to find the strength to protect myself and my daughter from people who could be so heartlessly cruel. The experience of giving birth completely alone at St. David's Medical Center was surreal and heartbreaking. The medical staff were incredibly professional and compassionate, but they kept asking where my husband was and when he would be arriving. I had to repeatedly explain that he wasn't coming, which led to concerned looks and whispered conversations among the nurses and my doctor. Dr. Patricia Williams arrived just as I was entering the final stage of labor. She was shocked and appalled when I briefly explained what had happened at home. As a physician who had delivered hundreds of babies, she had never encountered a situation where a husband had abandoned his wife during childbirth. She assured me that I was strong and capable of bringing my daughter into the world, and that her medical team would provide all the support I needed. Emma Rose was born at 4:37 in the morning, after 12 grueling hours of labor. The moment they placed her on my chest, I was overwhelmed with love, so intense it took my breath away. She was perfect, with tiny fingers that gripped mine immediately, and dark hair that reminded me of my own baby pictures. Despite the traumatic circumstances of her birth, she was healthy and beautiful, weighing 7 pounds and 2 ounces. The nurses offered several times to call Dennis and let him know that his daughter had been born safely, but I refused each time. I knew that he had made his choice when he and his mother locked me out of our home, and I wasn't ready to pretend that everything was normal. Emma and I deserved better than people who could be so cruel during our most vulnerable moments. During my 3-day stay in the hospital for recovery, I had plenty of time to think about what had happened and what I needed to do next. The nurses were wonderful, taking extra care of both Emma and me, and several of them shared their own stories of difficult relationships and finding strength they didn't know they possessed. Their support helped me realize that I wasn't alone and that I had options for moving forward. I used the hospital's phone to call my mother in Portland, who was absolutely horrified when I told her what Dennis and Geraldine had done. She immediately booked a flight to Austin, determined to help me and meet her first grandchild. Hearing my mother's voice and knowing she was coming gave me strength and reminded me that I did have family who truly cared about my well-being. I also contacted my principal at Westlake Elementary, Mrs. Martinez, who assured me that my teaching position would be waiting for me whenever I was ready to return from maternity leave. She was shocked by my story and offered to help in any way she could, including connecting me with other single mothers on our teaching staff who had successfully rebuilt their lives after difficult divorces. Most importantly, I began making practical plans for protecting myself and Emma legally and financially. I called a divorce attorney who specialized in cases involving new mothers and domestic disputes. She agreed to meet with me as soon as I was discharged from the hospital, and assured me that what Dennis and Geraldine had done was not only morally reprehensible, but also provided strong grounds for divorce and favorable custody arrangements. I also contacted our bank and learned about my rights regarding our joint accounts. As a legal account holder, I had the authority to freeze the accounts to prevent unauthorized withdrawals, especially given the circumstances of domestic dispute and abandonment. The bank representative was sympathetic and helpful, explaining my options for protecting our shared assets during divorce proceedings. On my second day in the hospital, Dennis finally appeared carrying flowers and a greeting card, as if nothing unusual had happened. He seemed genuinely shocked when I refused to let him hold Emma and informed him that he was no longer welcome in our room. He tried to argue that he had been protecting me by making sure I could focus entirely on giving birth without distractions. I looked at this man who had once been the love of my life holding our beautiful daughter and felt nothing but contempt and pity. I calmly informed him that our marriage was over and that he should expect to hear from my attorney very soon. I told him that his actions had shown me exactly who he really was, and that Emma and I deserved so much better than what he and his mother had put us through. When Dennis tried to insist that he had rights as Emma's father, I reminded him that fathers who abandon their wives during childbirth and lock them out of their homes don't deserve the title. I told him that any future contact regarding Emma would need to go through my lawyer, and I asked him to leave the hospital immediately. My return home with baby Emma 3 days after her birth marked the beginning of my carefully planned retaliation against Dennis and Geraldine. I had spent my time in the hospital not just recovering physically, but strategically planning how to reclaim control of my life and protect my daughter's future. The first phase of my plan involved making sure Dennis and Geraldine understood that their cruel actions had serious consequences. I had arranged for a locksmith to meet me at the house on the morning of my discharge. Mr. Rodriguez, the kind neighbor who had supported me during labor, had agreed to be present as a witness and to help me carry Emma inside safely. When we arrived at 10 in the morning, the locksmith was already waiting with his van parked in our driveway. The process of changing all the exterior locks took about 90 minutes. While the locksmith worked, I fed Emma in the nursery that Geraldine had rearranged without my permission. Looking around that room, I felt a sense of peace and determination that I hadn't experienced in months. This was our home now, Emma's and mine, and no one would ever make us feel unwelcome or unsafe here again. I had researched my legal rights thoroughly during my hospital stay. Since the house was jointly owned by Dennis and me, I had every legal right to change the locks for security purposes, especially as a new mother concerned about protecting my infant daughter. I also had the right to control who had access to our home, and I was exercising that right to exclude people who had proven themselves to be harmful to my family's well-being. When Dennis returned from work that evening at his usual time of 6:15, he found himself unable to enter what he still considered his home. I watched from Emma's nursery window as he stood on the porch, confusion evident on his face as he fumbled with his key and tried repeatedly to unlock the door. He rang the doorbell and knocked for several minutes while I let Emma finish nursing. Finally, I went downstairs and opened the front door with the security chain still attached, creating just a small gap through which we could speak. Dennis's face showed a mixture of confusion, anger, and disbelief as he realized what had happened. He demanded to know why he couldn't get into his own house and insisted that I open the door immediately. I calmly explained that the locks had been changed and that he was no longer welcome in the house. I reminded him that since the property was jointly owned, I had every legal right to change the locks for security reasons, particularly as a new mother protecting her infant child. I suggested that if he had questions about his legal rights, he should consult with an attorney. Dennis became increasingly agitated, raising his voice and demanding entry into the house. Several neighbors came out of their homes having heard the commotion, and I felt safer knowing that witnesses were present. I maintained my calm demeanor and refused to engage with his anger, simply repeating that he was not welcome and that any future communication should go through our attorneys. The situation escalated when Geraldine arrived about 20 minutes later, having been called by Dennis from his cell phone. She immediately began screaming about her rights as a grandmother and demanding access to see Emma. Her entitlement and anger were shocking, but I felt a cold satisfaction as I informed her that she had absolutely no legal rights to my house or to my daughter. I explained to Geraldine that her belongings would be packed and placed on the front porch the following day, and that she needed to make arrangements for somewhere else to live. When she threatened to call the police, I encouraged her to do so, knowing that I had done nothing illegal, and that the responding officers would likely have questions about why a husband had locked his laboring wife out of their home. True to my word, I spent the next morning carefully packing all of Geraldine's belongings into boxes and suitcases. I handled her things respectfully, but I wanted her completely out of our home and our lives. When she returned with Dennis that afternoon to collect her belongings, I watched from the window as they loaded everything into his car, both of them looking defeated and angry. The second phase of my plan involved protecting our financial assets. During my hospital stay, I had learned that as a joint account holder, I could freeze our shared accounts to prevent unauthorized access during our domestic dispute. This was particularly important since Dennis had already demonstrated controlling behavior around money and had opened accounts without giving me access. I visited our bank the day after changing the locks, bringing Emma with me in her car seat. The branch manager, Mrs. Sarah Johnson, was a woman in her 50s who seemed genuinely sympathetic to my situation. When I explained what had happened during Emma's birth and my need to protect our assets during divorce proceedings, she was both shocked by Dennis's behavior and helpful in explaining my options. Mrs. Johnson helped me place a freeze on all our joint accounts, including checking savings and the separate account Dennis had opened for baby expenses. This meant that neither of us could make withdrawals or transfers without both signatures until the accounts were legally divided during divorce proceedings. She also helped me open a new individual account where I could deposit my teaching salary when I returned to work. When Dennis discovered that he couldn't access our money later that week, he called me in a panic. He had apparently tried to pay some of his mother's credit card bills and discovered that the accounts were frozen. His voice was frantic as he demanded to know what I had done and insisted that I unfreeze the accounts immediately. I calmly explained that the accounts would remain frozen until our divorce was finalized and our assets were properly divided by the court. I reminded him that his controlling behavior around money had been one of many red flags in our relationship, and that I was simply protecting Emma's financial security and my own future. Dennis threatened to hire a lawyer and fight me for everything, including custody of Emma. I told him I looked forward to explaining to a judge exactly why his wife had been forced to give birth alone after being locked out of her home by her husband and mother-in-law. I suggested that he should carefully consider whether he really wanted those details to become part of the public record in family court. The community response to my situation was overwhelmingly supportive. Mrs. Joyce, who had called the ambulance the night Emma was born, had shared the story with other neighbors, and word spread quickly through our close-knit community. Many people were horrified by Dennis and Geraldine's behavior and went out of their way to offer support to Emma and me. Neighbors began bringing meals, offering babysitting help, and simply checking in to make sure we were okay. Several women in the neighborhood shared their own stories of difficult marriages and finding strength they didn't know they possessed. This network of support made me realize that Emma and I weren't alone, and that we had people who genuinely cared about our well-being. The social consequences for Dennis were significant and swift. Many of our neighbors began avoiding him, and some even crossed the street rather than engage in conversation. Mr. Thompson Joyce's husband made it clear that Dennis was no longer welcome at neighborhood gatherings or barbecues. The ostracism hit Dennis hard, as he had always prided himself on being well regarded in our community. The months following Emma's birth became a journey of healing growth and rediscovering my own strength. The divorce proceedings moved forward smoothly, largely because Dennis's abandonment during labor was well documented and witnessed by multiple neighbors and medical professionals. No judge could overlook the cruelty of locking a laboring woman out of her own home, and Dennis's legal team advised him to settle rather than risk a trial that would make his actions public record. I was awarded primary custody of Emma, with Dennis receiving supervised visitation rights that he rarely exercised. The house became mine, along with the majority of our shared assets, as compensation for his abandonment and emotional cruelty. The financial settlement ensured that Emma and I would be secure while I rebuilt our lives as a single-parent family. My mother stayed with us for 2 months after Emma's birth, providing invaluable emotional support and practical help during the most difficult period of adjustment. Having her there reminded me of what real family love looked like and helped me process the trauma of what Dennis and Geraldine had done. She would rock Emma while I cried, cook meals when I was too exhausted to function, and constantly remind me of my own strength and worth. Becoming a mother awakened a fierce protectiveness and determination in me that I had never experienced before. Every time I looked at Emma's perfect little face, I was reminded that I was responsible for keeping her safe and providing her with a loving, stable home. This responsibility gave me strength during moments when I felt overwhelmed by the challenges of single parenthood. I returned to teaching when Emma was 6 months old and found tremendous fulfillment in my career that I had somehow lost during my marriage. My kindergarten students brought joy and laughter back into my daily life, and being a working mother gave me a sense of independence and purpose that felt empowering. Several of my colleagues were single mothers themselves, and they became an invaluable support network. The financial independence that came with my teaching salary and the divorce settlement was liberating in ways I hadn't anticipated. For the first time in my adult life, I could make decisions about money without asking permission or justifying my choices to anyone. I could buy groceries without criticism, decorate my home according to my own taste, and plan for Emma's future without interference. Emma thrived in our peaceful, loving home environment. She was a happy, healthy baby who rarely cried and seemed to sense the calm stability that now characterized our daily life. Without the constant tension and criticism that had filled our house during my marriage, both Emma and I flourished in ways that reminded me of how toxic our previous situation had been. Dennis eventually moved away from Austin, with Geraldine unable to face the social consequences of their actions in our community. He pays court-ordered child support as required, but has shown little interest in developing a meaningful relationship with Emma. Rather than feeling sad about his absence, I felt relieved that Emma wouldn't grow up exposed to his selfishness and emotional unavailability. The experience taught me invaluable lessons about recognizing red flags in relationships and trusting my own instincts. I realized that I had ignored early warning signs about Dennis's inability to stand up to his mother and his tendency to dismiss my feelings and opinions. I learned that healthy love requires mutual respect, support during difficult times, and the willingness to prioritize your partner's well-being. I also discovered the importance of maintaining my own identity and independence within a relationship. During my marriage, I had gradually lost touch with friends' interests and aspects of myself that didn't align with Dennis and Geraldine's expectations. Rebuilding my life as a single mother allowed me to rediscover who I was and what I valued most. 2 years after Emma's birth, I look back on that traumatic night as a turning point that ultimately led to the best decisions of my life. While the betrayal was devastating at the time, it freed me from a toxic relationship and allowed me to become the mother and woman I was meant to be. Emma and I have created a home filled with love, laughter, and genuine happiness. I feel no bitterness or hatred toward Dennis and Geraldine, only gratitude for the clarity their cruelty provided. Their actions showed me exactly who they were and saved me from years of continued emotional abuse and manipulation. Sometimes we need to experience our worst moments to find the strength to create our best life. The woman I am today is stronger, wiser, and more confident than I ever was during my marriage. I trust my instincts, value my independence, and refuse to settle for relationships that diminish my worth. Emma is growing up seeing her mother as a strong, capable woman who created a beautiful life for both of us through determination and self-respect. For anyone facing similar situations of emotional abuse, manipulation, or abandonment, I want you to know that you are stronger than you realize and you deserve so much better. Trust your instincts when people show you who they really are, and don't be afraid to take the steps necessary to protect yourself and your children. Sometimes, the most painful experiences lead to the most beautiful transformations. The night I was locked out while in labor was the worst night of my life, but it led to the best decision I ever made. Emma and I are living proof that sometimes we must be broken down completely before we can rebuild ourselves stronger, happier, and more authentic than ever before. What would you have done if you found yourself in my situation? Have you ever had to find strength you didn't know you possessed during a difficult time? I'd love to hear your thoughts and experiences in the comments below. If this story resonated with you, please give it a like and subscribe for more real-life stories of courage and transformation. Share this video with anyone who might need to hear that they're stronger than they know and deserve to be treated with love and respect. Thank you for listening to my story, and I wish you all the strength to create the life you and your loved ones deserve.